Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by UNA, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barnard. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is David Loseby. David is a former CPO, a speaker, an author, a pracademic, a title he may actually have come up with, an advocate, as well as being the editor of two very well-regarded journals, the Journal of Public Procurement and the Journal of Responsible Production and Consumption, both from Emerald. So, hi, David. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Kelly. Much appreciated.
So did you invent pracademic, or is that a term that I heard through you, but that other people use as well?
I wish I had, and I was really, really disappointed because I came up with the title pracademic independently and then found out that somebody beat me by about a couple of years or so when I did my research. So I was quite sort of disappointed, shall we say, not to be the creator, shall we say, in a sense of that particular reference. But I've certainly been using it for quite a number of years and for very obvious reasons, as I'm sure we'll dig into.
Absolutely. And actually, to that point, let's start there. So I talked about a lot of the things that you're up to. You're clearly in a lot of different things going on in the procurement and the larger supply management community. But what else do you find that it's interesting for people to know, either about your past experiences or about your sort of combined business academic approach to the space?
Sure. I think the one thing I would say is that my career has been anything but linear. It's been actually sort of anti-linear, if there is such a term. And if it's new, then I'll claim it. Thank you very much. I think for me, in a sense, my career has been one of different sort of sectors, different disciplines. But I think the constant really has been change and transformation and people. And I think that the more I sort of think about this and reflect upon it, I started off in property and construction. I moved into pharmaceuticals, and then went into sort of doing. In fact, I actually did change director roles earlier in my career. But then the major things that happened were particularly on the what I call the international global scale, where I had, multinational teams, living and working in different countries, some nice, some not so nice, shall we say, and then the move into sort of procurement and supply chain became quite a natural segue from managing as a VP within a pharmaceutical business. And it was the classic sort of poacher term, gamekeeper, as we call it, which is, having been subject to lots and lots of procurement, but actually the organization said, well, we spend £2 or £3 billion a year on capital and construction and equipment and all those kind of things, but we're finding it really difficult to engage with the stakeholders. But maybe we engage you then to do the procurement piece, and the rest was history from there, really. And I think along the way, the recognition is that classic, sort of the light goes on where I went rather begrudgingly, I have to admit, to a CPO conference thinking, oh, not another conference sort of thing. And went along and listened to a guy called John Henk, who probably lots of people have probably never heard of, but he'd linked the sort of what I call behaviors to the way in which procurement teams performed and the way in which then their stock price was then reflected in the American automotive industry. And the light went on for me in terms of the fact that actually lots of things that we do were all about sort of really human behavior. And that then set me on the journey to the PhD in behavioral science. And I guess that's then where the natural fusion then of the practitioner and the academic came about, which is hence the pracademic, if you like, reference. And so it's been, anything but, linear, the whole journey. But I think what that's done is give me quite a a richness and a diversity of perspectives that help shape and inform the way potentially I'd like to think I think and work with others.
Well, I think that behavioral piece is so important because, it's interesting. Of course, we're going to talk about technology today and how it's driving change. But at the end of the day, we're also all still people. And I will speak for myself here. I am not evolving as fast as the AI that I have access to is evolving. So I'm doing my very best to keep up. I think I'm a pretty good sport about it. But what actually made me ask you to come on the show is a specific article that you wrote. And I'm going to make sure wherever this goes, the link will be there so people can read it for themselves. But it's a piece you wrote for CPO Strategy that looks forward to procurement about 10 years out. So we're thinking procurement 2035. And you've argued that just adding a little bit of AI isn't enough to make procurement's future what it can be. Can you speak very high level sort of about the premise of that article and what it might get into in terms of misunderstandings around how much change we're going to need to really make a difference?
Yeah, I think I'll probably start off by saying that the World Economic Forum around about sort of year 2000 said that the half-life, in other words, the life of our skills as individuals, was about sort of 20 years. So therefore the half-life was 10 years. And I thought, oh, all right, okay, then that's not too bad. So learning some new skills and dropping some old skills every 10 years doesn't sound quite so bad. By the time we'd hit sort of COVID, they reckoned it was about 5 years. So, quite a rapid shift.
And that becomes uncomfortable.
Yeah, then you start to think, oh, hang on a minute, that's going to have some impact. And then literally, they said actually by probably around about 2028, 2029, the half-life of skills is probably going to be 3 years.
Wow.
And so you start to think about this whole shift in your skills and your knowledge and your ability to enact and lead in a world where it's just changing at a pace that we have never, ever seen before. We think about the various sort of industrial revolutions and the shortening of that sort of horizon, I think tells me that actually simply doing, more of the same is simply not sufficient. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I think the fact that, no matter how much we won't want to say, yeah, it's fine, I've only got another 20 years of my career to go, or whatever the number happens to be, the harsh reality is that an awful lot is going to change in that time period, way beyond anything that we've experienced. And interestingly, even in a conversation with Ben Farrell, the group CEO of SIPS recently, the recognition that the utilization of new and different skills, and including, dare I say, some of the things that are really, really important that, like what I call the fixed or the open mindsets, or the growth mindset, hugely important in terms of leadership and behavioral skills. And the classic sort of fixed mindset that says, actually, I don't want things to change at all. I'm quite happy with the way they are. In some ways is almost going to become the impediment to people's, I'll call it even their enjoyment in the modern world and the way in which they then work in the business world. And so, even simplistic things like that are going to become real markers in terms of what we then gain and what we then take from both social and business as it evolves. So I think this whole shift is so rapid, it's quite invasive, but also I think that ability not just to simply learn, but I think also to both understand and then challenge the way in which AI is sort of feeding its way into the workplace. And it's interesting, I've been to several conferences recently where, one speaker or another has gone, so how many people have got AI formally in their business? And you might see a couple of hands go up. You then ask the same question, which is how many people are using AI anyway? Almost everybody's hand goes up. And you go, well, okay, and that tells us enough in terms of the story to say that we simply can't ignore this. It's not going to go away. So I think that for me, the shift is quite, I'll call it tectonic. And what I mean by that is that, that the shift is going to be quite pronounced and something that we have to embrace. We can't simply ignore and pretend it's going to go away, because it absolutely isn't. And I think, the more and more we dig into this around this sort of, I sort of talked about sort of the different characteristics of high openness, high conscientiousness, high extroversion, even low neuroticism, and this agreeableness sort of quotient that we have as part of our personality traits. These are really important factors, and none of this is taught in, professional bodies, university courses, whatever. Yet, not just the procurement supply chain profession, but is actually quite ubiquitous in a sense that it goes across all the professions. And so that sort of different level of thinking and that different comprehension of the I'll call it the actors that are in play, is so important.
Yeah.
And I think this is where the article was centered around saying, well, actually, we need to think about sort of not just the sort of the traditional frame, but we need to think about the future frame that has to be a lot more dynamic, interchangeable. It needs to be a lot more agile and flexible in the way in which it works and operates, and almost cutting away those sort of, I'll call it those traditional and mainstay things that we've all held on to very dearly, is something that we're just going to have to do, because if we don't, they then become impediments and block us to the way in which we operate and engage and socialize and all those things.
Well, I think it's interesting you bring up Ben Farrell, because we also recently had him on Art of Procurement. And so I know he's got a military background in addition to currently running SIPs. And I think where this, at least from my thinking, factors into what we're talking about is that, a couple of things. You've talked about some of the things that make us uncomfortable are truly not a choice, right? This must be dealt with. This must be absorbed. This must be overcome. But I also think it's a leadership challenge. And it's almost like the stronger and more influential the technology becomes, the more we need really effective human leadership. If we think about how all of this, either today or looking forward a little bit, is starting to affect the role of CPO, specifically at that top layer of the organization, what are some of the things that you're seeing now or that you anticipate as part of this larger change that you've talked about?
One of the things that I see, and a very simple illustration would be to say, if we think about the typical organization chart, it's got all the heads of this and, all the people in the org chart. I think in the future state, we'll start to see, yes, there'll be real people, but there'll also be agents that sit in those organization charts. And these agents will perform specific roles and functions and will interact just in the same way as would be a human being. Now, I recognize for some people that getting their head around that is going to be quite challenging. However, what I think it will do is it will drive a discipline around saying, let's be really, really clear what Janet, John, Mary, and all the rest of it are going to do, because getting that absolute clarity around roles, responsibilities, even it's almost like sort of a service level agreement between different components, if you like, within that organizational structure. And so I think things like that will start to become a lot more commonplace. I think even down to the teaching of how do I construct, how do I frame questions into a large language model? What kind of governance do I need in place? Even down to the, I witnessed this in the early days when AI came along and everybody went, oh, great, I can write my research paper, so they'd all have a go at sort of putting the stuff in. And of course, it would then spit out a lot of, hallucinations, and particularly the real giveaways were, and this is based on the citation from this paper, and I'm going, I don't recognize that paper. I've never ever seen it. So you go look that paper up and you go, it doesn't even exist. It doesn't even exist. Even the authors' names aren't real. So you started then to become very suspicious and untrusting. So you have to then start to say, well, okay, then. So if I'm going to cut down the hallucinations and I'm going to get this really properly, how can I put it, framed and scoped, I've got to be very precise and very clear about saying, it's a bit like going shopping. If you went shopping and you were looking for hair care products, you wouldn't go to the garden section. So you have to be really clear and say, you must look in this aisle, and it's aisle number 37, and it's between sections 10 and 14 or whatever. So you're very prescriptive about saying items from this area are acceptable. Anything that might be sort of fertilizer from aisle 23 somewhere else is not acceptable. It might look the same, it might be in a plastic container just the same, but it isn't the same. And so having that sort of, how can I put it, understanding and comprehension that you have to be really prescriptive. And it's interesting, because what you then realize more and more is actually this partnership between AI and human, and particularly the humans that are experienced, particularly humans that have got that experiential knowledge, as well as gain knowledge from wherever the sources may be, is so an important component of this thing. So the reality is that you and I probably both know that you might want to write an article or something like that. Now, whilst you might get some ideas from AI, the curation and the style and the formation of that article and all those kind of things has to come from you as an individual. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's got your name at the bottom of the page. So you need to take ownership for it. So you can't abdicate the ownership of something that is generated like that. So there is this sort of partnership, but it's a bit like, meeting new colleagues in a business. You have to work out, how to work with those different people, because, the classic sort of, if you work around the business for all these different departments, you have to engage with different people in different ways, and their preferences, their lexicon, all those kind of things are going to be different. So you can't just use a one size fits all, because that doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because we've talked about soft skills for a long time in procurement. And I do think it was, as I said, I think all of the behavioral observations and sciences we can learn from are interesting. But you also listed out earlier a number of what I would almost consider personality traits, which is slightly different from either behaviors or soft skills. You talked about, let's see how many I can hit. Introversion versus extroversion, it's sort of having general goodwill or being pleasant to work with. And then neuroticism, we can all, have different points of view on that. What is it from a personality standpoint that's either going to allow us to work effectively with these new technologies, or that's going to give us the edge to preserve the human contribution? Because, I'll be honest, if somebody is unpleasant to work with, unreliable, that's the first priority I'm going to have for replacing something with AI, versus if there's a very creative, resourceful, pleasant colleague, you don't even really think about, well, how could technology possibly do that? It's not necessarily the right logical way to think about it, but I think as a human response, these personality traits come in. Where for you do these different types of traits, and you may have added others, kind of fit into this whole equation?
Well, I think the more you get to realize, and I'll give you an example. If you think about as a big five personality trait, openness, So if somebody's got a very closed mindset and they're not open to new ideas in a changing world that is demanding new and fresh skills, different types of engagement, all those kind of things, then that's not going to work in simple terms. So it then becomes, if you think about organizations that certainly I've worked in the past, whereby, well, we did that last year, so we're going to do the same again this year type of thing. In a world that's, how can I be entrenched in a polycrisis of, huge magnitudes, the need for change, agility, flexibility, all those kind of things is absolutely paramount. And so the personality piece, in the sense that says, I feel uncomfortable moving out my comfort zone, if that makes any sense, then you have to recognize that, in that instance, then the reality is that that's not a leadership sort of trait, in a sense, that you want to see. Equally so in terms of conscientiousness, which is, I'm just going to leave it to somebody else to figure out how this blooming AI thing works type of if you
Or
like.
put my name on something I did not write because the deadline is approaching.
Exactly, all those kind of stuff. Then that's not acceptable. And I guess the humility, as I call it, in a sense, of the modern leader, and the way in which they interact, engage, is so different to even, dare I say, 20 years ago. Huge change. And if you think about that, just in the space of 2 decades, the shift has been quite significant. And I think that what people are realizing is that in this world, people have a lot more choices. They have a need to sort of, I'll call it, engage and respect people, rather than be commanded to do something because this particular individual is the boss type of stuff. I mean, I remember working for certain nameless C-suite executives in the past, thinking, I just really cannot engage with you, because and the problem is then that then sets the whole tone in terms of, I'm only going to share the minimum amount of effort. I don't trust you. The least amount of engagement I've got with you, the better. So that's not a recipe for success. And particularly if you're thinking about, actually you're looking for leadership to make decisions, if they're making decisions on, how can I put it, the de minimis of information and insights, that is definitely not a recipe for success. So I think these do have a big and fundamental bearing on the way in which we operate. And I think, people are recognizing more and more now that they, and probably is true even going back over the decades, people typically work for other people, not necessarily for organizations per se. And I think the problem is that but the reality, I should say, is that we're beginning to realize this more and more and more, which is a good thing, because that then means that I'll call it the poor leadership, in a sense, that we have seen, starts to get called out much sooner, much quicker, and becomes a differentiator, particularly when we're looking for competitive advantage, because competitive advantage does mean that we actually all work as a collective, and even down to simple things whereby, I've seen some bosses that I've had in the past who have claimed credit for things, and you go, you didn't even deliver that. That was delivered by me or my team or whatever. It doesn't matter, but it's not the attribute of the individual, and you just think, I can't subscribe to that, because that's not a behavior or behavioral trait, I should say, that I am particularly enamored with.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting as we start to think about some of these leadership challenges in an era with so much change, and where you said the half-life of sort of skills development expectations is shrinking. I actually think it provides a good transition to something that's a tradition here at the Sourcing Hero podcast. So David, I'm going to give you 2 questions. You can pick either one to answer. And I promise that you cannot give an incorrect answer. This is one of those. This is an audio Rorschach test. So your choices are, what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? Or if you want to go a little bit broader, what do you think heroism looks like in a business context?
Wow. I think for me, a sourcing hero is somebody that actually keeps all parties on board, but also is a very authentic and honest broker. In other words, they won't make false promises or expectations. They will listen and be empathetic to those around them, irrespective of where they sit within, I'll call it, the supply ecosystem or the organization or whatever. And I think that for me, the natural sort of sourcing hero is somebody that becomes respected for what they do and how they do it, not because of their job title or because of the position that they hold or the fact that they're the final signatory to a contract. They do it through their deeds, if you like, in a sense, their behaviors and the way in which they operate. So it's nothing to do with rank, title, or anything that is of that kind of description, if you like. It's through, if you like, in a sense, I'll call it a more naturalistic sort of support, engagement, and acceptance of them and the role that they play.
Yeah. Well, super interesting conversation, David. I definitely recommend that everybody read your article. As I said, I will make sure it's in show notes and social links and all of that. If people are meeting you through this conversation and would like to connect with you, would like to read some of your other work, where's the best place for them to go to learn more?
For me, always, I would say LinkedIn. Fortunately, I have a strangely spelt sort of surname that I think is relatively uncommon. So you should be able to find me out there in LinkedIn. I'm pretty sure. So please do connect, and I'll be more than happy to accept.
David, thank you so much for being here today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.